as you mentioned, and that is true. But even when that much value is on the table, many organizations still default to closed models. We have, I mean, as much as we love open source, as much we like open, but organizations, they always pick and choose what works for them. As there is a saying, use the right tool for the right job. In most cases, the right tool happens to be open source tool. But in your research, what is the single biggest reason enterprises keep choosing closed models over open models, even when open models are not only cheaper, but sometimes they are free of cost?
It's a great question, and so unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that because the data that we have doesn't let us understand why companies are using these models, right? Or why they're choosing to use one versus the other. We're looking at getting some new data and running some surveys and things like that to dig into that. So hopefully I will have an answer for that. But I do think that, just anecdotally talking to companies, at least from what I've heard, there's kind of two big reasons, right? One is a misunderstanding and the other is sort of a valid, concern in my book. The misunderstanding is I've heard the phrase in talking to multiple companies, governments, organizations, things like that, that if we use open models, then our data becomes open as well. And that's like that to me is just a misunderstanding, right? I mean, you think about, actually in many ways, if you're running open models and you're keeping them in your own servers, then your data never leaves your own system, right? Your own firewall. Whereas if you're relying on external closed proprietary models that are running in the cloud or running on, some server somewhere else, then your data actually is leaving your environment, right? And so I think that's one common misconception is that open models mean that the data ends up being open or things like that. And it's actually quite the opposite. So if that's the rationale that companies are using closed models instead of open, that I would say is incorrect. They should, there's a misinformation there. Now, on the flip side, the point I made about thinking about support and liability concerns and what happens if something goes wrong, who's going to fix it, who's going to take the liability. There, I think there's a more reasonable business case to say, well, if we're using OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or whoever, then we're sort of offloading some of that risk of that, that if something goes wrong and something weird happens, then like we have somebody to call to help deal with that. Whereas in the open model space, at least at the moment, there's not really anybody to call in the middle of the night when something goes wrong, right? And so I think that's a big piece of why a lot of the businesses are deciding to use closed models is that they feel that there's more support for them. Now that said, when I talk to startups where they care more about the cost, there everybody's relying more on the open models because the cost is just so much cheaper, and they care a bit less about the liability and the product support and the things like that.
Let's also talk about, s- some next practical steps. These reports, these, they serve a purpose. Not only that we collect information what is going on, but we use that information to further improve things. For an organization that is already experimenting with AI, where is the low hanging fruit to start shifting from closed to open models without sacrificing quality, reliability, or supportability in production? Because sometimes these open models are not just cheap, they are free. So it's just like different tools for different. You cannot just look at AI as a big giant, what do you call it? Sledgehammer, yeah, yeah. So you can use open models for some purpose, proprietary models, or so. But how to get started? What are the low hanging fruits where they can start without risking too much?
I think that's a great way to think about it, right? And so I think, like any technology, especially new ones, a bit of experimentation can go a long way, right? And so I do think that, for companies that are trying to figure out what to use and what they should use, a little bit of experimentation can go a long way, right? And so do you care about, what do you care about? And then thinking about the priorities, do you as a company, what do you care about? Do you really care about the ability to, have tech support, have liability concerns, things like that, which very valid concerns? Or do you care more about the ability to tweak and tinker and play and be cost effective? And, that's going to lead you in one direction versus the other. And then the other thing too, I think that, independent of kind of the tinkering is just education, right? Like an understanding a little bit more about like the pros and cons and the use cases, of the open versus closed models, to think a little bit more about, what exactly do we need it for? And what are these bucket of models good at? And what are these bucket of models good at? Because I think that's often all too quickly, people will just say, oh, like everybody's using ChatGPT, so that's what I should be using for all my AI purposes, right? And obviously, like, I use ChatGPT. I use lots of different AI tools, right? And so I think it's important to remember that, like, just because that's the one that's like the leader at the moment, that's not necessarily the one that is going to kind of carry the day in the long term, right? And it's not necessarily the one that's going to be the right tool for your use case in particular. And so I think really that evaluation of exactly what you need, education around, what the options are out there, and then tinkering is sort of the three steps I would give companies, suggest to companies follow, to try and figure out exactly what's the best solution for them.
A lot of open models, they also allow you to fine tune them based on your use cases, so you cannot do with a closed source model like I do a lot with my own work. I have put my own prompt there, the whole, I have not created any MCP because I don't need that, but I can refine the model, so it over a period of time, like it knows that I'm journalist, the tone changes, it has all the data. You cannot do that with proprietary models as well. So what are the other things that you can do only with open models, not with proprietary, so that organization can dip their toes in those?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, and indeed, I think the ability to customize has always been a benefit of openness, right? Forget about AI, but go all the way back to the operating system. That ability to customize has been super important from the get-go. But I do think that the closed models are making it easier to kind of train on data that's within your environment and customize and fine tune a bit. But we're seeing so much more of that activity happening with the open models on platforms like Hugging Face and internally at companies, that I do think that at least at the moment, if you're looking to build these sort of customized solutions, open is definitely the right path for you to build on top of. And I think I even a couple of weeks ago I was at an event where with some governments from Africa, and they were talking about how they a lot of the models as they currently exist don't handle African language as well, right? Just because there's less broad content on the internet and in those languages, and so they haven't been trained as well. And so they were talking about how they've actually been building on top of open models to train them better to recognize their local language, right? And I think that's a great use case of open models, is that you can invest a bunch of resources into this to really make a good model that fits the use case, in this case of a country level, for whatever it is you're trying to build, right? Whereas in a closed model, like, they may get to that. I'm sure they will at some point. They'll train them better on various languages. But if you want that today, and you have the capabilities and the resources to invest in kind of building it at least a little bit yourself, but you don't want to start from scratch, then the open models are really the place that you can build those trained, fine-tuned models much more effectively on top of.